What happens when a player the establishment keeps trying to contain walks into the most sacred building in basketball and refuses to act like a guest? Not during a WNBA Finals game. Not during March Madness. Not even during one of her own matchups. Madison Square Garden. NBA broadcast. Primetime spotlight. And Caitlin Clark didn't shrink. For over a year, the conversation around Clark has lived in two extremes. On one side, the numbers. Sold-out arenas. Record television ratings. Merchandise flying off shelves. On the other side, the constant doubt. Too much hype. Too many turnovers. Too much attention. Not enough respect paid. The whispers never stopped. They just evolved. So when she stepped onto NBC's NBA set at Madison Square Garden, this wasn't supposed to be historic. It was framed as a crossover. A feel-good segment. A network play for extra eyeballs. A quick experiment. But experiments don't usually make legends uncomfortable. Because that's what this was. She wasn't sitting next to random analysts. She was flanked by basketball royalty. Men who defined eras. Men who built reputations inside that very building. The kind of names that usually make even confident rookies lower their voices. Instead, something else happened. She leaned forward. From the moment the cameras turned on, her posture said everything. She wasn't perched politely on the edge of the chair waiting for permission to speak. She wasn't nodding along to veteran takes. She wasn't delivering rehearsed soundbites. She cut in. She challenged points. She broke down defensive rotations like she'd been covering the NBA for a decade. And that's when the tone shifted. Because the narrative heading into that night was predictable. Social media had already decided how this would go. The comment sections were filled with quiet skepticism dressed up as analysis. Let's see if she actually knows the men's game. This is just marketing. She'll look out of place. But she didn't look out of place. She looked comfortable. That comfort is what rattled people. There's something deeply unsettling to gatekeepers when someone walks into a protected space and doesn't ask for directions. Madison Square Garden is not neutral territory. It exposes you. The lights are unforgiving. The crowd is ruthless. The basketball culture is layered with history. And yet, when Clark walked onto that floor before the broadcast, the reaction wasn't polite applause. It was a roar. New York fans don't hand that out easily. They boo their own stars. They turn on legends. They don't cheer because someone is trending. They cheer when they sense authenticity. When they recognize competitive fire. She felt it. And she fed off it. That's what Stephen A. Smith picked up on almost immediately. He wasn't reacting to a viral clip. He was reacting to body language. The kind of subtle signals seasoned analysts notice. The eye contact. The timing. The refusal to hesitate before disagreeing. This wasn't a cameo. It wasn't promotional fluff. It felt deliberate. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. Because when a WNBA star commands an NBA desk in the most iconic arena in basketball, the conversation stops being about gender. It stops being about crossover appeal. It becomes about influence. Influence is power. And power shifts create tension. Up until that moment, critics could still frame Clark's impact as temporary. A college phenomenon riding momentum. A rookie benefiting from hype cycles. A player whose popularity might cool once the novelty faded. But Madison Square Garden isn't novelty territory. It's legacy territory. And she didn't look temporary. She looked like she belonged. That's what made this different from every other appearance she's made. Not the microphone. Not the set design. Not the celebrity seating arrangement. It was the absence of hesitation. When analysts made broad claims, she countered with specifics. When discussions drifted toward cliché, she brought them back to detail. Shot selection angles. Defensive spacing. Transition reads. Not surface-level commentary. Surgical breakdowns. That's when the narrative started cracking. Because it's one thing to be popular. It's another thing to be precise. The establishment can tolerate hype. Hype fades. Hype burns out. Precision lasts. Stephen A. Smith has built a career on recognizing leverage shifts before they become obvious. And what he saw that night wasn't just a talented guard dabbling in television. He saw someone expanding territory. Clark wasn't stepping into NBA coverage to participate. She was stepping into it to prove something. And proving something implies resistance. You don't prove yourself in spaces that fully welcome you. You prove yourself in rooms that are quietly evaluating whether you deserve to be there. That evaluation was happening in real time. Every facial expression, every half smile, every subtle pause after she spoke. You could feel the recalibration happening around her. This wasn't about whether she could talk basketball. It was about whether the basketball world was ready to admit she could talk their basketball. There's a psychological layer here that most viewers missed. Clark has been dealing with controlled skepticism since before she entered the WNBA. Every record came with an asterisk. Every milestone came with a qualifier. Every praise came balanced with a but. She's great, but. She's exciting, but. She draws ratings, but. That night at Madison Square Garden, there was no but. There was just performance. And performance under pressure is the only language that cuts through bias. The most telling moment wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. Mid-discussion, she disagreed with a take about late-game shot selection. Calmly, directly, confidently, she explained why the analytics supported the long three. She referenced spacing tendencies. She didn't overtalk. She didn't over-explain. She finished her point and leaned back. Silence. Not awkward silence. Processing silence. That's when respect is earned. And that's when resistance hardens. Because every shift in hierarchy creates two reactions. Recognition and resentment. Recognition from those secure enough to appreciate talent. Resentment from those threatened by acceleration. Acceleration is the key word here. Clark's rise hasn't followed the traditional staircase. It's been an elevator. From college phenomenon to league draw to national broadcast centerpiece in record time. And fast ascents disrupt structures. That's why this night mattered more than people want to admit. It wasn't about a Lakers game. It wasn't about Knicks defense. It wasn't about a random Sunday broadcast. It was about territory. A WNBA player stepping onto an NBA platform and refusing to play small. Stephen A. Smith didn't explode for entertainment value. He reacted because he recognized the shift. He saw how comfortable she was challenging narratives. He saw how easily she held the room. And holding the room is everything. Basketball culture has long been guarded by unwritten rules. Earn your stripes. Stay in your lane. Wait your turn. Clark doesn't appear interested in waiting. That's not arrogance. It's competitive wiring. The same wiring that made her take logo threes in college arenas packed with doubters. The same wiring that turned every road game into a spectacle. The same wiring that now has NBA executives watching her segments with more attention than they expected. Because when influence starts crossing leagues, it stops being a moment. It becomes a movement. And movements don't ask for permission. They create momentum. The Madison Square Garden debut wasn't loud in the traditional sense. No viral meltdown. No on-air confrontation. No dramatic walk-offs. It was quieter than that, which made it more dangerous. Because the most significant power shifts often happen without fireworks. They happen when someone proves they don't need validation from the system they're entering. Clark didn't look like she needed approval. She looked like she expected equality. That expectation alone changes the dynamic. And once a dynamic changes, it rarely resets. By the time the broadcast ended, something intangible had settled in. A realization. Not just among fans, among insiders. She wasn't testing the waters. She was expanding the shoreline. The conversation after that night wasn't, did she do okay? It was, what does this mean going forward? And that's a much bigger question. Because if this wasn't a one-off, if this wasn't just a ratings experiment, If this was positioning, then the balance of influence in basketball media might be shifting faster than anyone predicted. The gate didn't swing open for her. She walked through it anyway. And that's only the beginning. Before she ever touched a microphone, the narrative was already written. Not by NBC. Not by the producers. By the crowd waiting to see her stumble. Madison Square Garden is not a friendly laboratory. It's a proving ground. The walls are layered with ghosts, championships, collapses, rivalries, grudges. Players don't just show up there. They get measured there. And Caitlin Clark wasn't arriving as a Hall of Famer. She wasn't coming in as a retired legend transitioning to media. She was an active WNBA player stepping into NBA coverage, surrounded by men who had built their identities inside that building. On that desk sat names that defined eras: Carmelo Anthony, New York royalty; Vince Carter, whose dunks once bent physics; Tracy McGrady, a scoring machine whose name still carries weight in every basketball debate. That's not a casual lineup. That's a hierarchy. And hierarchies don't usually shift quietly. The critics understood that. Before the cameras even rolled, social media was buzzing with quiet skepticism disguised as objectivity. Let's see how she handles real analysis. Breaking down the NBA isn't the same as playing college ball. This is marketing, not merit. The underlying tone wasn't subtle. It was gatekeeping wrapped in politeness. There's an unspoken rule in basketball culture: respect must be earned in stages. First you dominate your lane. Then you prove longevity. Then maybe, if the timing is right, you're invited into broader conversations. Clark skipped stages. That's what irritated people. Her rise hasn't followed the staircase model. It's been vertical. College dominance. Record-shattering viewership. Immediate economic ripple effects in the WNBA. And now, national NBA coverage. For analysts who spent years grinding for studio time, that speed feels disruptive. Imagine dedicating decades to carving out a media seat, only to watch a 22-year-old walk into the center chair at Madison Square Garden. Not as a sideline reporter. Not as a halftime novelty. As a voice. That's where the tension lives. And tension is amplified under bright lights. Producers knew the risk. Networks don't accidentally place someone in that position. NBC was making a calculated decision. The league knows ratings fluctuate. The network knows nostalgia alone doesn't drive consistent numbers anymore. They needed gravity. Clark has gravity. But gravity pulls in both directions. When the red light turned on, there was a split second where everything could have confirmed the doubters. A nervous laugh. A deferential tone. Overly cautious takes. Instead, she leaned into the discussion like she'd been there before. She didn't wait to be called on. She didn't over-apologize before disagreeing. She didn't dilute her analysis. That's when the energy shifted. Body language tells the truth before words do. She wasn't perched at the edge of the seat. She wasn't folded inward. She wasn't performing gratitude. She was engaged. And engagement implies belonging. Belonging is what unsettled people. Because if she belongs there, then the categories separating leagues start dissolving. They stay in your lane, logic collapses. The invisible border between NBA and WNBA influence begins to blur. Blurring lines threatens order. The expectation heading into the night was simple. Let her participate, let her speak, but keep the structure intact. Let the legends lead. Let her orbit around the conversation. She didn't orbit. She inserted. When discussion turned to defensive rotations, she broke down angles without hesitation. When shot selection came up, she didn't default to safe phrasing. She referenced tendencies, percentages, spacing logic. Specific silent skepticism faster than confidence ever could. There's a difference between sounding smart and being sharp. The first can be rehearsed. The second shows up under pressure. This was pressure. New York pressure. The crowd outside the studio wasn't indifferent. Cameras caught reactions when she walked near the court. The response wasn't curiosity. It was volume. MSG doesn't cheer because of brand deals. It cheers for edge. Clark carries edge. That's why the room didn't feel like a promotional event. It felt like evaluation. And here's the psychological twist most viewers missed. The pressure wasn't entirely on her. It was on the desk. Because if she outperformed expectations, it wouldn't just elevate her. It would recalibrate the perception of who gets to control NBA discourse. Every time she spoke clearly. Every time she challenged a point. Every time she avoided cliché language. The hierarchy adjusted a millimeter. Millimeters add up. The discomfort wasn't loud. It didn't manifest as open hostility. It surfaced in micro-expressions. Subtle pauses. Slightly delayed responses after she made a point. That's how recalibration looks in real time. Stephen A. Smith has built a career reading those shifts. He recognized it instantly. This wasn't about entertainment value. It was about territory. Because if Clark could hold her own in that environment, not survive, but command, then the argument that her popularity is isolated to one league loses strength. And that's dangerous for anyone invested in keeping ecosystems separate. The narrative had been carefully maintained for years. The NBA is the pinnacle. The WNBA is growing. Growth is good, but separate. Clark doesn't operate in separate lanes. Her college run blurred lines first. Viewership numbers began overlapping. Merchandise trends shifted. National conversation centered on her regardless of league. Now, sitting at Madison Square Garden dissecting NBA plays with authority, she was accelerating that blur. And acceleration creates friction. Some viewers tuned in hoping to see cracks. They were ready to screenshot awkward moments. Ready to clip stumbles. Ready to say, "See? She's out of depth." They didn't get that moment. They got composure. They got competitive intensity masked as calm. They got someone who understands that media presence is another arena. And that's where the underestimation collapsed. Because the expectation wasn't excellence. It was containment. Containment failed. She didn't shrink to fit the format. She didn't dilute her voice to match the tone. She didn't defer automatically to experience. She treated the conversation like she treats the court. Read the space, find the angle, attack decisively. And when someone plays decisively in a space designed to test them, the entire dynamic shifts. By the midpoint of the broadcast, the question had quietly changed. It wasn't, "Does she belong here?" It was, "How often will she be here?" That's a completely different conversation. The stage was set for hesitation. For nervous energy. For overcompensation. Instead, it became a display of control. Not dominance in the loud, confrontational sense. Control in the subtle, professional sense. That's harder to dismiss. Because loud moments can be reframed as emotional spikes. Control under pressure looks like inevitability. And inevitability is what scares gatekeepers the most. The building didn't reject her. The desk didn't overpower her. The moment didn't swallow her. It adjusted around her. That adjustment is the beginning of every shift in influence. And this was only the opening act. It was supposed to be harmless. A quick pre-game segment. A light shooting game. A little entertainment before the serious analysis began. Nothing political. Nothing territorial. Just a friendly round of horse between Caitlin Clark and Jamal Crawford. That's how it was framed. Fluff. But there's one problem with fluff when Caitlin Clark is involved. She doesn't recognize it. Because when there's a rim, there's a scoreboard. And when there's a scoreboard, there's a winner. And when there's a winner, there's a loser. The first round didn't go her way. Crawford, a legendary ball handler with decades of NBA experience, took the opening game. The crowd reacted. The desk laughed. It looked like a routine segment playing out exactly how producers probably imagined. If this were just branding, the script would have ended there. Smile. Handshake. Transition to the next segment. But something shifted. According to multiple reports amplified later during breakdowns, Clark didn't treat it like branding. She treated it like a loss. And that's where the tone changed. Instead of laughing it off, she immediately asked for a rematch. Not jokingly. Not for theatrics. She wanted best of 3. On the spot. That request alone tells you everything about her wiring. Most athletes in promotional settings protect optics. They avoid risk. They don't gamble their image in unscripted moments. Especially not against a respected NBA veteran on national television. Clark doubled down. Because losing on camera, even in a cute segment, wasn't acceptable. There's a competitive gear some players access when the stakes are obvious. Championships. Playoffs. Rivalries. Then there's a different kind of gear. The private gear. The one that activates even when the stakes are symbolic. Clark lives in that gear. When the rematch started, the body language was different. No casual shots. No playful rhythm. She locked in. Logo attempts. Quick releases. Eyes fixed. Trash talk started surfacing. Not disrespectful, but sharp. The kind of psychological edge that signals seriousness. Crawford isn't a novice. He spent years embarrassing defenders. He understands competitive aura. He knows when someone flips a switch. Clark flipped it. And she didn't just win the second game. She dismantled the third. What was supposed to be filler turned into a statement. And here's why that moment matters more than people think. Because marketability often gets mistaken for softness. When fans see endorsements, commercials, massive shoe deals, they subconsciously assume polish, control, PR discipline. They don't expect ruthlessness. Clark carries both. That's rare. She can sell jerseys and still demand a rematch over a pre-game shooting game. That contradiction unsettles people. The narrative around her has oscillated between two extremes: overhyped marketing machine or overrated media darling. Moments like this collapse that narrative. Because media darlings don't demand rematches. They protect optics. Competitors demand rematches. There's a psychological pattern here that echoes through her career. Every time she's underestimated, she responds by escalating the stakes. Lose the first round? Make it best of 3. Face physical defense. Shoot from deeper range. Get questioned publicly? Put up numbers. It's not reactive in an emotional sense. It's strategic. The Jamal Crawford segment exposed that instinct in a space many assumed would soften her edge. Instead, it sharpened it. And that sharpening matters because it changes how the NBA audience sees her. The crossover wasn't just about commentary. It was about energy. Crawford is respected. He's admired. He's comfortable in front of cameras. If she had hesitated, the clip would have circulated differently. Instead, the viral narrative became about her competitiveness. And competitiveness translates across leagues. You don't have to follow the WNBA to recognize that fire. That's the crossover advantage. Clark doesn't need people to understand her resume. They just need to see her compete. What made the moment even more significant was timing. This wasn't late in the broadcast after she'd proven herself verbally. This was early, pre-discussion, before she'd fully established her analytical voice. She set the tone with action. Action carries weight in basketball culture. Words can be debated. Numbers can be contextualized. Energy cannot be faked. When she refused to let that segment end on a loss, she was sending a message that extended far beyond Crawford. She was signaling to the entire desk, and to viewers, that she doesn't compartmentalize effort. There is no small moment. Everything is a competition. That mentality is uncomfortable for those who prefer clear boundaries between promotion and performance. Clark blurs those boundaries instinctively. Stephen A. Smith seized on that detail later, because it fits a larger pattern he's been tracking. People keep mistaking visibility for vulnerability. They see popularity and assume fragility. But popularity backed by competitive obsession is a different animal. That's harder to displace. Because if she were only popular, backlash could slow her down. If she were only skilled, market forces could minimize her exposure. She's both. And that duality is what makes moments like the Crawford segment feel symbolic. It wasn't about who can shoot trick shots better. It was about control. Control of narrative. Control of perception. Control of momentum. By winning the rematch decisively, she reframed the clip before anyone else could. It stopped being NBA Vet School's WNBA star. It became Clark refuses to lose, even here. That shift matters in subtle ways. NBA audiences respect stubborn competitiveness. It's woven into the mythology of the league. Jordan's stories, Kobe's stories, Bird's stories. They all orbit around refusal to accept defeat, even in scrimmages. When Clark displayed that same refusal on an NBA stage, it inserted her into that psychological lineage. Not as imitation, as alignment. Alignment breeds acceptance. And acceptance from the NBA audience is what disrupts traditional separation. Because once fans see her as a competitor first and a WNBA player second, the old framing weakens. The Jamal Crawford moment wasn't loud. There were no heated arguments. No viral screaming matches. Just a quiet refusal to lose. But quiet refusals often echo louder than dramatic outbursts. It revealed something important. She doesn't turn off the edge for optics. That edge carries into commentary, into business decisions, into negotiations. Which means the crossover wasn't just entertainment. It was reconnaissance. She stepped into NBA territory, assessed the energy, and responded the only way she knows how: compete until control shifts. And if that was just the warm-up, the real tension was still building. Because competition is one thing. Disrespect is another. And that part was coming. It only took one sentence. Not a rant. Not a confrontation. Not even an argument. Just a comparison. And suddenly the entire atmosphere shifted. During the broadcast, Hall of Famer Reggie Miller attempted what sounded, on the surface, like a compliment. He compared Caitlin Clark's style of play to Peyton Pritchard, a solid, respected NBA role player. Now here's where context matters. Peyton Pritchard is a capable shooter. Tough. Smart. Valuable in his role. But he is not the face of a league. He is not reshaping viewership trends. He is not driving cultural shifts in basketball economics. Clark is. So when that comparison landed, it didn't feel neutral. It felt small. And the internet noticed immediately. This wasn't about insulting Pritchard. It was about scale. When a player who shattered NCAA scoring records, sold out arenas across the country, and altered WNBA television numbers gets compared to a bench contributor, the undertone becomes impossible to ignore. It wasn't explosive disrespect. It was subtle minimization. And subtle minimization often cuts deeper. The camera caught her face for a split second. A slight eyebrow lift. A pause. A micro-expression that said more than any rebuttal could. She didn't laugh it off. She didn't argue. She didn't correct him on air. She let it sit. That silence did something powerful. Because silence under provocation reads as confidence, not insecurity. Stephen A. Smith didn't stay silent. When he later addressed the moment, he framed it differently. He didn't attack Miller personally. He attacked the pattern. Because that's what this felt like. A pattern. When male rookies explode into relevance, comparisons escalate upward. They get linked to legends. They get attached to aspirational names. Even prematurely. But when Clark does it, the comparisons trend sideways. Manage expectations. Temper hype. Keep the hierarchy stable. That's the subconscious instinct of gatekeeping culture. Smith's reaction wasn't just protective. It was analytical. He asked the obvious question. If a young male player was averaging her numbers, generating her ratings, commanding her merchandise sales, would he be compared to a role player? Or would the names be bigger? Larry Bird, Steph Curry, Magic Johnson. Those names come up quickly in male discourse. Clark's comparison didn't. That's why the moment mattered. It exposed the invisible ceiling many pretend doesn't exist. And ceilings are rarely enforced with open hostility. They're enforced with tone, with framing, with compliments that limit scale. Clark's response wasn't defensive. It was strategic. She continued the broadcast like nothing happened. She broke down plays. She stayed sharp. She didn't let the moment derail her rhythm. That composure flipped the power dynamic. Because now the comparison looked out of step. When you downplay someone who is visibly holding the room, the downplay feels forced. And forced narratives crumble fast in live environments. The irony is what made the moment resonate online. Viewers weren't debating whether Clark belongs in NBA conversations anymore. They were debating why the comparison felt off. That shift is critical. Instead of questioning her competence, the audience started questioning the framing. That's influence. Once the audience starts defending you organically, resistance weakens. Stephen A. Smith understood that immediately. His breakdown wasn't emotional outrage, it was pattern recognition. Clark keeps getting scaled down rhetorically, while her impact keeps scaling up materially. That mismatch creates tension. And tension attracts attention. The more you attempt to confine someone whose numbers contradict confinement, the louder the contradiction becomes. Clark didn't need to respond to Miller directly. The contrast did it for her. She's driving viewership surges. She's altering broadcast strategies. She's expanding into NBA coverage. Those aren't Pritchard-level ripple effects. Those are structural ripples. And structural ripples demand structural comparisons. By not engaging in a defensive response, she avoided playing into the hierarchy game. Arguing would have positioned her as reactive. Silence positioned her as secure. Security under subtle dismissal reads like inevitability. That's what unsettles traditionalists. Because if you can't shake someone with overt criticism, and you can't shrink them with polite minimization, then what's left? Performance. And performance was about to provide the loudest answer possible. Because while debates brewed over comparisons, the numbers were preparing to speak. And numbers don't carry tone. They carry proof. Debates can stretch for days. Clips can circulate for weeks. But numbers end arguments. When the ratings for that Madison Square Garden broadcast came in, the conversation shifted from opinion to proof. The Lakers vs. Knicks matchup, a solid game, but not a holiday, not opening night, not a playoff preview, pulled over 4.5 million viewers. That made it the most watched non-Christmas, non-opening NBA broadcast of the season. Pause there. Because context matters. This wasn't a finals rematch. It wasn't a historic rivalry night. It wasn't a record-breaking performance from LeBron. It was a regular season game. And yet it surged. Executives don't look at box scores first. They look at viewership charts. And that chart spiked. The explanation wasn't complicated. Viewers tuned in for basketball, yes. But they also tuned in to see how Caitlin Clark would look in that environment. Would she stumble? Would she shine? Would she hold her own? Curiosity converts to clicks. Clicks convert to ratings. Ratings convert to leverage. Stephen A. Smith didn't hesitate when he saw those numbers. She is the needle. That phrase isn't poetic. It's financial. In sports broadcasting, the needle refers to the person who moves viewership beyond baseline expectations. Not incremental bumps. Noticeable swings. Clark moved it. And that movement rewrote the framing of the entire debate. Because now the question wasn't whether she deserved to be there. It was whether networks could afford not to bring her back. Ratings are the language executives understand best. No amount of old-school discomfort overrides measurable audience growth. This is where influence shifts from symbolic to structural. Symbolic influence is viral clips and trending hashtags. Structural influence is contractual leverage. When a crossover appearance drives that kind of audience response, it doesn't stay a cameo. It becomes strategy. And strategy implies repetition. Clark didn't just perform well. She justified investment. That's what made this moment so dangerous to skeptics. Because skepticism thrives in ambiguity. When results are mixed, narratives can be shaped. When impact is hard to measure, opinions dominate. But when 4.5 million people tune in and sustain viewership across segments, ambiguity fades. The argument that people are tired of her evaporates quickly when millions voluntarily click in. The claim that she's overexposed weakens when exposure generates growth. The theory that her appeal is confined to one league collapses when NBA broadcasts surge during her presence. This wasn't hype. It was data. And data doesn't respond to emotion. It forces recalibration. Executives at NBC likely didn't need dramatic speeches that night. They needed graphs. They needed comparison metrics. They needed confirmation that the crossover wasn't a gamble. They got confirmation. And once confirmation enters the room, resistance gets quieter. Because now any opposition to her presence looks irrational from a business standpoint. Sports media is ultimately an industry. Industries respond to revenue signals. Clark sent one. The ripple effect of that rating spike extends beyond a single broadcast. It signals to sponsors. It signals to advertisers. It signals to league partners. She can carry weight across platforms. That cross-platform appeal is rare. Very few athletes transcend their league without controversy defining the narrative. Clark's crossover moment wasn't built on scandal. It wasn't built on rivalry drama. It was built on competence and curiosity. That's sustainable. And sustainability is what amplifies leverage. If she can drive NBA viewership during the WNBA off-season, her value multiplies. She stops being confined to seasonal impact. She becomes year-round relevance. Year-round relevance is a bargaining chip. And bargaining chips change dynamics. Stephen A. Smith's tone shifted after the numbers dropped because he understood the long game. He's negotiated contracts. He knows how networks evaluate assets. When someone proves they can elevate viewership in a space traditionally dominated by established names, that person stops being a guest. They become a variable. Variables that drive growth get protected. That's where the power shift quietly begins. Because once executives see measurable upside, they start planning future slots, future integrations, future appearances. And every additional appearance normalizes her presence. Normalization dissolves resistance over time. The most interesting layer of this entire rating surge is psychological. People tuned in partly out of curiosity, to see if she would fail. But failure didn't materialize. Curiosity turned into validation. And validation builds loyalty. That loyalty isn't just tied to her WNBA performances. It starts attaching to her personality, her analysis, her presence. That broadens her brand beyond the court. Which means critics now face a tougher obstacle. It's hard to frame someone as overhyped when their presence correlates with measurable growth. The marketing gimmick narrative weakens. The diversity hire whisper fades. Because numbers don't carry ideology. They carry impact. And impact attracts investment. The 4.5 million viewers didn't just watch a game. They watched a recalibration. Networks saw proof that Clark's influence isn't confined to her league. Analysts saw proof that audiences are open to her voice in broader basketball discourse. Skeptics saw something harder to dismiss than confidence. They saw traction. And traction builds momentum. Momentum builds inevitability. Once inevitability enters the equation, resistance changes shape. It becomes quieter, more subtle, more behind the scenes. Because arguing against growth becomes harder when growth is visible. The ratings didn't just validate her performance. They escalated the stakes. Because now, the crossover isn't a one-time curiosity. It's a precedent. And precedents have consequences. Especially for those who feel their territory narrowing. Success doesn't eliminate friction. It amplifies it. And that amplification was already beginning. Success doesn't silence critics. It reorganizes them. The moment those ratings hit, something else started brewing behind the scenes. Not outrage, not open hostility, but discomfort. Because when someone enters your space and proves profitable immediately, the conversation changes from, can they do it? To, how often will they do it? And that's where resentment starts. Imagine grinding in sports media for years. Internships, guest spots, regional desks, waiting for the call to sit at Madison Square Garden during a primetime NBA game. Then an active WNBA player steps into that seat, not cautiously, not experimentally, but confidently. That doesn't just challenge hierarchy. It accelerates it. Acceleration is threatening. In every industry, when someone moves faster than the traditional path allows, it forces others to reevaluate their own trajectory. Clark didn't climb the media ladder rung by rung. She entered near the top. That shift doesn't sit comfortably with everyone. Publicly, most analysts were professional, welcoming, congratulatory. But privately, friction rarely announces itself with microphones. It whispers. She hasn't paid dues. She's taking spots. This is just ratings chasing. Those whispers don't need to be shouted to carry weight. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The whispers aren't entirely about her. They're about scarcity. Studio seats are limited. Prime-time exposure is limited. Influence windows are limited. When someone with massive audience gravity enters that ecosystem, the distribution changes. More focus on her means less focus somewhere else. That's the part few admit out loud. Stephen A. Smith hinted at this dynamic when discussing the broader reaction. He pointed out that legends on the desk, players secure in their legacies, didn't seem rattled. Security breeds generosity. Insecurity breeds gatekeeping. Notice the pattern. Those who have cemented their place tend to welcome talent. Those still defending their place often resist acceleration. Clark's crossover blurred lines between leagues, between media lanes, between traditional paths. Blurring lines destabilizes comfort zones. For decades, the NBA and WNBA operated in parallel lanes. Crossover happened occasionally, but rarely with this level of gravity. The ecosystems were adjacent, not integrated. Clark's presence on that desk made integration feel possible. Integration threatens traditional separation. Some purists prefer clear boundaries. They prefer leagues to remain compartmentalized. They prefer influence to stay in assigned boxes. Clark doesn't operate in boxes. That's what makes her disruptive. Disruption doesn't need to be loud to be powerful. Sometimes it's just sustained presence. And sustained presence in prime NBA territory forces recalibration. There's another psychological layer here. Clark isn't just popular. She's profitable. Profit amplifies resentment faster than popularity alone. Because profitability justifies repeated opportunity. If she were simply a viral personality, networks could experiment once and move on. But when viewership spikes, the experiment becomes investment. Investment signals long-term potential. Long-term potential signals reallocation of resources. That's when whispers grow. Not necessarily against her talent, but against her speed. She's doing too much too fast. That's often coded language for discomfort with acceleration. Acceleration challenges fairness narratives. Those who climbed slowly may feel bypassed. But markets don't reward patience. They reward traction. And Clark generates traction across demographics. Young viewers, casual viewers, hardcore fans curious about the crossover. She expands the funnel. Expanding the funnel changes the power equation. Because now executives aren't asking whether she fits. They're asking how to maximize her impact. Maximization means more appearances, more crossovers, more integration. Each additional appearance chips away at the idea that she's a temporary guest. And once the guest label disappears, the resistance sharpens. Not openly, quietly, behind production meetings, inside contract negotiations, within internal debates about format changes. But here's where the resentment narrative struggles. Clark doesn't present as invasive. She presents as prepared. She knew the stats. She knew the schemes. She knew the players. Preparation disarms criticism. It's hard to argue someone is unqualified when they clearly did the homework. That's what makes the resentment harder to justify publicly. If she had stumbled, critics would have had ammunition. But competence under pressure leaves little room for overt dismissal. So the resistance shifts to tone. She's everywhere. The coverage is too much. Let's spread the spotlight. Spreading the spotlight sounds fair. But in media economics, spotlight follows attention. And attention followed her. The crossover didn't diminish the NBA brand. It strengthened engagement. That complicates opposition. Because now any pushback risks looking anti-growth. Stephen A. Smith's blunt framing, essentially telling critics to get over it, wasn't just bravado. It was business realism. Sports media isn't built on tradition alone. It's built on engagement metrics. Clark brought engagement. Engagement sustains programming. Programming sustains careers. That's the paradox. Even those privately uncomfortable with her acceleration benefit from the ratings lift she provides. That tension creates internal conflict. Appreciation mixed with discomfort. Respect mixed with territorial instinct. And that's exactly where disruptive figures thrive. They don't need unanimous approval. They need undeniable impact. Clark has that. The resentment isn't about whether she can analyze basketball. It's about whether she should be allowed to expand her influence this quickly. And the market already answered that question. The answer was yes. Which means the friction isn't going away. It's evolving. Because this wasn't just a one-night appearance. It felt like positioning. And positioning implies something bigger on the horizon. Guest appearances feel temporary. They come and go. They trend for a night. They fade by the next cycle. This didn't feel temporary. It felt intentional. There's a difference between being invited to sit at the table and quietly measuring how big the table is. Caitlin Clark wasn't testing the temperature at Madison Square Garden. She was assessing the room. And that matters because positioning is rarely obvious in the moment. It only becomes clear when you zoom out. Look at the timing. The WNBA season is shorter than the NBA's. That leaves months of off-season visibility. Months where most players disappear from the mainstream sports conversation. Clark doesn't disappear. She expands. Her NBA on NBC appearance wasn't just about one broadcast. It demonstrated that she can operate in the NBA media ecosystem without shrinking her identity. That opens doors. Regular contributor segments. Rotational appearances. Cross-league features. Contract leverage. Once she proves she can hold an NBA desk and drive ratings, she stops being a novelty. She becomes a multi-platform asset. And multi-platform assets are rare. Most athletes are tied tightly to their league calendar. Their relevance spikes during season and dips afterward. Clark just showed she can sustain relevance outside her primary league. That changes everything. Because once you're not confined to one schedule, your negotiating power multiplies. Stephen A. Smith understands contract leverage better than most. When he framed this as more than a one-off, he wasn't speculating wildly. He was reading the industry. If an NBA broadcast spikes with her presence, why wouldn't networks integrate her more often? If her analysis resonates with both NBA and WNBA audiences, why restrict it? If sponsors see crossover traction, why keep campaigns siloed? The boundaries start dissolving. And dissolving boundaries terrify purists. There's a faction of basketball culture that prefers strict separation. NBA here. WNBA there. Commentary lanes clearly defined. Clark complicates that structure. She isn't asking to replace anyone. She's expanding space. But expansion feels like encroachment to those guarding territory. That's why this wasn't just about analysis quality. It was about precedent. If Clark becomes a recurring presence on NBA broadcasts, she becomes a bridge between leagues. Bridges redistribute traffic. Traffic equals influence. Influence equals revenue. That ripple effect reaches far beyond one studio desk. It impacts sponsorship dynamics. It affects player branding strategies. It shifts how networks design programming blocks. And here's the deeper layer. By succeeding in NBA territory, Clark elevates the perception of the WNBA product. If the face of the WNBA can sit across from NBA legends and dissect the men's game confidently, it forces audiences to reconsider assumptions about the women's league. It reframes the narrative. Not separate and smaller, but parallel and competitive. That's subtle. But subtle shifts compound. Clark's positioning that night wasn't loud activism. It wasn't confrontation. It was competence. Competence in a traditionally guarded space sends a powerful message without saying it outright. She didn't argue for integration. She embodied it. That embodiment matters more than speeches ever could. Because viewers don't change opinions through lectures. They change them through exposure. Exposure to competence. Exposure to confidence. Exposure to fluency. Clark delivered all three. And when exposure leads to engagement, engagement leads to normalization. Normalization dissolves resistance over time. The most strategic part of this entire crossover is that it doesn't require confrontation. She doesn't need to challenge the old guard publicly. She just needs to keep showing up and performing. Each appearance becomes harder to criticize. Each rating spike becomes harder to ignore. Each segment becomes easier to justify internally at networks. That's how positioning works. It's incremental until it feels inevitable. The Trojan horse analogy fits here, not in a manipulative sense, but in a structural one. She entered the NBA conversation as a guest, but her presence carried the WNBA brand with it. Every time she referenced training intensity, every time she casually mentioned league competitiveness, every time she spoke from experience rather than theory, she was advertising the women's game without directly promoting it. That's strategic crossover. And strategy signals intent. Clark isn't stumbling into opportunities. She's maximizing them. Maximization is threatening because it implies foresight. When someone demonstrates foresight this early in their career, it disrupts assumptions about longevity. She's not just a hot streak. She's building infrastructure around her influence. Infrastructure is durable. Durability scares skeptics more than hype ever could. Hype burns out. Infrastructure compounds. This appearance hinted at infrastructure. If she continues to expand into NBA media spaces, her brand stops being league-specific. It becomes basketball-specific. And that's a much bigger arena. Basketball-specific influence doesn't shrink when seasons end. It carries across cycles. Which means critics betting on fatigue may find themselves waiting longer than expected. Because fatigue rarely sets in when competence meets curiosity. Clark's positioning that night wasn't about taking over loudly. It was about demonstrating that she can operate anywhere basketball is discussed. And once that demonstration is public and measurable, the conversation changes permanently. This wasn't about whether she belongs. It was about how far she intends to go. And judging by that performance, she's not thinking small. There's a moment in every power shift where someone says the quiet part out loud. Stephen A. Smith did exactly that. After breaking down the performance, after dissecting the comparison, after reacting to the ratings, he didn't frame it as a feel-good crossover. He framed it as inevitability. And inevitability is what unsettles people most. Because you can debate hype. You can critique form. You can argue about turnovers. You can't argue with momentum forever. Smith's message was blunt in tone, even if he didn't phrase it dramatically. The more people push back against Caitlin Clark, the larger her footprint becomes. We've seen this pattern already. When critics questioned her physical durability, she responded with volume scoring. When veterans challenged her toughness, she leaned into the contact and kept firing. When comparisons tried to shrink her scale, the audience expanded her reach. Resistance hasn't slowed her. It's amplified her. That's a dangerous pattern for detractors. Because if opposition feeds acceleration, then criticism becomes fuel. Smith recognized that dynamic clearly. He pointed out something psychological that often gets overlooked. Clark doesn't chase approval from the old guard. She chases execution. There's a difference. Athletes who crave approval soften themselves to fit rooms. Athletes who crave execution sharpen themselves regardless of room. Clark doesn't appear interested in validation from established hierarchies. She's interested in performance. That mindset makes her unpredictable. Because if she doesn't need endorsement from gatekeepers, then gatekeepers lose leverage. Leverage shifts quietly at first. It starts with tone. Then it moves to placement. Then it settles into contracts. The Madison Square Garden appearance wasn't about proving she can speak fluently on television. It was about proving she doesn't need to shrink to be invited back. Smith compared the look in her eyes during certain moments, particularly after the subtle comparison, to something he's seen in other generational competitors. Not arrogance. Certainty. Certainty reads differently than confidence. Confidence says, I hope I belong. Certainty says, I know I do. When someone operates with certainty in a space that historically filters entrance carefully, the filters weaken. Because certainty is contagious. Fans sense it. Executives sense it. Even critics sense it. That's why the resistance hasn't been loud condemnation. It's been recalibration. And recalibration often means adaptation rather than rejection. The warning Smith delivered wasn't aimed at fans. It was aimed at the establishment. He essentially framed Clark as a market force rather than a media experiment. Market forces don't respond to preference. They respond to demand. If audiences continue showing up when she shows up, the market will continue placing her in visible positions. That's not ideology. That's math. And math overrides tradition in broadcast economics. There's also a broader cultural layer here. Clark's expansion into NBA spaces signals a generational shift in how fans consume basketball. Younger audiences don't segment leagues the way previous generations did. They follow personalities. They follow narratives. They follow intensity. Clark embodies intensity. Intensity travels well. It travels from college to pro. From WNBA to NBA. From court to studio. The old guard grew up in systems where access was filtered tightly. Appearances were controlled. Influence was linear. Clark is rising in an era where digital traction accelerates access. That difference in era explains some of the discomfort. But eras don't pause for nostalgia. They evolve. Smith's warning wasn't combative. It was predictive. If she continues performing at this level across platforms, the debate won't be about whether she should appear on NBA coverage. It will be about how central she becomes to it. That's a much bigger shift. Because once centrality increases, the ecosystem adapts around her rather than accommodating her. Adapting around someone signals acknowledgement of their gravity. Gravity changes orbit. And once orbit shifts, reverting back becomes difficult. The most telling part of this entire situation is how little Clark needed to say. She didn't deliver speeches about equality. She didn't demand recognition. She didn't frame her appearance as symbolic. She just executed. Execution is disarming. It removes rhetorical ammunition. Critics can argue about narratives. They struggle to argue with Composure plus ratings. Smith's final framing captured that energy. If you're waiting for her momentum to slow, you may be waiting longer than expected. Because this wasn't a peak moment. It felt like an expansion phase. Expansion phases are rarely linear. They accelerate. Each new platform feeds the next. Each successful appearance increases curiosity for the next one. Curiosity increases engagement. Engagement increases opportunity. Opportunity increases visibility. Visibility increases influence. That loop is powerful. And once that loop stabilizes, it's difficult to interrupt without catastrophic failure. Clark hasn't shown signs of catastrophic collapse. She's shown adaptability. Adaptability sustains loops. That's why the warning matters. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was grounded in trend recognition. Smith has seen careers surge and fade. He understands how quickly hype can dissolve when unsupported. This didn't feel unsupported. It felt layered. Layered influence lasts longer than singular viral moments. And layered influence is exactly what she's building. The question isn't whether the establishment approves. The question is whether they can keep pace. Because if she continues bridging leagues, commanding ratings, and maintaining competitive edge across formats, the conversation will stop being about crossover novelty. It will become about structural evolution. And structural evolution doesn't ask for permission. Just happens. That night at Madison Square Garden wasn't a closing statement. It was an opening signal. The kind that echoes longer than people expect. If you strip away the noise, if you remove the social media arguments, if you ignore the subtle jabs and the defensive reactions, what happened at Madison Square Garden becomes very clear. This wasn't a cameo. It wasn't a publicity stunt. It wasn't a "let's see how she does" experiment. It was expansion. Caitlin Clark didn't just sit on an NBA desk. She proved she could command it. She didn't just play a light pre-game shooting segment. She turned it into a competitive statement. She didn't just absorb a minimizing comparison. She let performance and ratings answer it for her. And then the numbers spoke. Over 4.5 million viewers. That's not hype. That's leverage. Leverage changes how rooms operate. Before that night, critics could still frame her rise as contained within the WNBA. They could argue that her popularity was isolated, that crossover curiosity would fade, that the attention cycle would cool off. But expansion doesn't cool off when it finds traction in new territory. It compounds. The key word here is territory. Clark entered NBA space and didn't look foreign. She looked fluent. She looked comfortable. She looked competitive. And most importantly, she looked inevitable. Inevitable is the word nobody wants to say out loud yet. Because once you admit inevitability, you stop debating whether someone belongs. You start adjusting to their presence. That's what this felt like. Adjustment. Networks adjusting to the ratings spike. Analysts adjusting to her composure. Fans adjusting to her voice in broader basketball conversation. And the adjustment wasn't forced. It was earned. There's something psychologically powerful about watching someone step into a guarded environment and not flinch. No overcompensation. No apology. No nervous shrinkage. Clark didn't act like she was borrowing space. She acted like she was expanding it. That's the difference between participation and positioning. Participation is temporary. Positioning is long-term. Everything about that night hinted at long-term. The competitive edge in the Crawford segment. The restraint during the comparison moment. The analytical sharpness on air. The measurable ratings boost. Those aren't isolated flashes. They're components. Components build structure. And structure sustains eras. Stephen A. Smith didn't react the way he did because it was entertaining television. He reacted because he recognized a pattern he's seen before. When audience gravity shifts toward a new center, basketball culture doesn't change overnight. But it evolves in moments like this. Moments where a line that once felt rigid suddenly looks flexible. Clark's crossover didn't diminish the NBA. It energized it. It didn't shrink the WNBA. It elevated perception of it. That's the paradox critics struggle with. They assume expansion means replacement. It doesn't. It means integration. Integration creates new dynamics. New dynamics create new opportunities. And new opportunities attract resistance. But resistance without results loses power. Results without resistance gain momentum. Clark is operating in the second category. And if this appearance was any indication, we're not watching a peak. We're watching a platform expand. The gate didn't open for her. She stepped through it anyway. And once someone proves they can operate on multiple stages without shrinking, it becomes very difficult to push them back into a single lane. Now here's where it gets interesting. This channel is still small. The conversation around these moments is just getting started. And the truth is, stories like this don't unfold in one broadcast. They unfold over time. Through patterns. Through repeated signals. If you want to stay ahead of where this era is heading, if you want deeper breakdowns, sharper analysis, and honest discussions about the power shifts happening in basketball right now, then this is the place to be. Subscribe. Not casually. Intentionally. Because when you subscribe, You're telling the algorithm that you want more intelligent basketball conversations, not recycled headlines. Like the video if you believe Clark's influence is expanding beyond one league. And drop a comment. Was this just a crossover moment, or the beginning of something much bigger? The next phase is coming. And if this debut told us anything, it's that the expansion has already started.